Welcome to Bits and Borders, a podcast exploring frontier tech and frontier markets. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and for today's episode, I'm very excited to speak with David Z. Morris, who's an old colleague from CoinDesk and is the author of the book Stealing the Future, which is a deep dive into the effective altruism movement that birthed characters like Sam Bankman-Fried. David is incredibly talented when it comes to piecing together the ideology and the players that make up the effective altruism movement. He's very articulate at explaining how this ideology continues to live on in various policy debates surrounding artificial intelligence. He has a lot of strong and at times controversial opinions, but he also brings the receipts to back them up. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with David as much as I did. David, it's great to have you here.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on. I periodically like to do these Sam Bankman-Fried episodes because there's just like so you can never do enough of these things. There's just so many layers to the onion, you know.
It's an incredible story. It definitely never stops, and it never stops being, I think, significant for crypto in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe to get started, I would love you to introduce yourself, give us some background on yourself and the book that you've written here.
Yeah. So for those who don't know me, my name's David Z. Morris. I have been a financial journalist for staggeringly like 13 years at this point. My background is actually in academia. I have a PhD in the history of technology and then transitioned to journalism and writing about sort of the present day of technology. I wrote for Fortune for a long time. I was on staff there for about a year and a half. But was a freelancer for them for 7 or 8 years. And then I did a couple of things in crypto. I was one of the only people doing like freelance work for mainstream publications back in like 2016, 2017. I wrote about the block size wars for Slate. I wrote about various, important things for mainstream outlets. And I was present for the announcement of Ethereum in 2015. I've been around for a long time. And then I worked for CoinDesk for about 2.5 years. And obviously at that time, Sam Bankman-Fried was kind of a big topic for a little while as like the leader of FTX. And then of course, a huge topic as the leader of the failed FTX. And the team there, Nick Baker and other people I was working with actually found the leaked balance sheet that Ian Allison was the main person who got this big scoop that wound up winning us, unfortunately, the last journalism awards CoinDesk will ever win. But I wrote an essay about in sort of November. We can get into it, but I wrote an essay about how it was a crime before he got charged that I think had a big impact. And then, unfortunately, again, maybe I'm giving it all at once, but because CoinDesk was under the same umbrella of Digital Currency Group as a trading shop called Genesis that had loaned FTX a bunch of money, our reporting blew up FTX, FTX blew up Genesis, and then Genesis blew us up. And so by August of 2023, I had lost my job at CoinDesk. And I've been independent since then, and it's been going great. I covered the trial for a website called Protos, and that reporting of the FTX criminal trial then became the basis of my book that was out in early November, so just about a month ago. I guess it's backwards, but it's called Stealing the Future, and it has been going really well. I just got a great review in the American Prospect. They called it among the most important books of the year. So that feels pretty great. And that more or less brings us up to today.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And it was kind of crazy watching this whole saga play out in real time where the CoinDesk reporting blows up FTX and then that in turn blows up CoinDesk's parent company. And then, it's
I've often said there should be some version of like a Purple Heart for journalism where you actually like report so well that you hurt yourself.
Right. And I guess we go into the whole, the state of crypto media has sort of only gone downhill since then, sadly. But I guess that's a whole nother conversation. But So in the 3 years since that those events that you just described, there's been a flurry of different kind of Sam Bankman-Fried books and coverage and just, you know, I mean, the trial was kind of the big show of the century almost, you know, back in, was it last year or was it the year before? Like, I can't even.
It
Losing
was
track of
2 years
here.
ago now.
Was it 2 years ago now?
In fact, my book turns out was published. Not the actual. No, it was, the publication date was November 11th, which maybe I'm wrong, but it was just about 2 years to the day from his conviction in early November of 2023. So it's been 2 years since the trial now.
Okay, wow, time is just flying by here. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, so there's been a few different like kind of books and folks trying to kind of catalog and just make sense of what all happened with FTX. I think we have like a reasonably good idea of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But you took like a very different tact with this book, and you set out to kind of frame this as not just like Sam as this sort of like rogue kind of crazy like weird kid from Stanford, you know, a bad actor trying to scam people, but more of as like a product of this sort of kind of dysfunctional tech culture, effective altruism type of soup of like melting pot of just these kind of weird ideas that are, he's kind of like the manifestation of some of that in a way. So I'm really excited to talk a bit about some of that. And maybe you can just kind of give us sort of the overview of like, why did you decide that there was like a need to write a book kind of focusing on this particular angle?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's two things, right? There have been some really good FTX books. In particular, I always point people towards Brady Dale's. At this point, I can't remember whether Brady ever worked at CoinDesk, but Brady is a longtime crypto reporter who has worked a lot of great places. His book is amazing. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the title for the moment, but luckily his name is easy to remember. I recommend it to everybody. It's the most like granular financial analysis. Unfortunately, and this is kind of the way that publishing works in certain ways. So Brady's book was published before the trial. So was Michael Lewis's, and so was even Zeke Fox's. Bloomberg reporter Number Go Up is another book that talked a bit about FTX, although it wasn't the focus. So a lot of this stuff came out before the trial. And while Brady gets a lot of stuff right, he did not have the forensic analysis that came out during the trial. And then the other big book, of course, is Michael Lewis's, which unfortunately, as I go into in great detail in the book, is wildly inaccurate to the point where it essentially amounts to a part of the conspiracy. And I don't think that Michael Lewis was, secretly paid by FTX. I don't think that he was, actually, part of some inner circle. I think, and I sort of point this out about a lot of people who wound up making similar gestures to try and defend Sam Bankman-Fried. I just think that Michael Lewis was so captured by the ideologies and the social settings around FTX that he only saw things from their perspective. And so one of the things that came out afterwards, in fact, weirdly enough, from talking to Tiffany Fong, who spent a lot of time with Sam Bankman-Fried while he was on house arrest ahead of the trial, was that Michael Lewis was going in there, having dinner with the parents frequently. He once he showed up in court at trial, which he only attended a couple of days of the trial, but he was very friendly to the parents. Clearly, they saw him as an ally. And he, of course, made a lot of comments both before, during, and now after the trial, essentially using his artistic approach to language to avoid exactly saying that he thought SBF was innocent, but effectively saying that he thought SBF was innocent, that he had been railroaded, making all of these sort of baseless claims. And I don't know what your relationship to Michael Lewis is, but for me, it was very sad. Because he has written some great financial journalism, written some books that really explain things, especially for those of us who lived through the financial crisis. He's obviously a significant figure. So it's quite sad to see him basically successfully conned by a con artist, and write a whole book about it, and blow his reputation up in various other ways along the way. And so that's a big part of why the book is written, is because there simply was not another comprehensive overview of the entire situation that was accurate in terms of describing the crime that took place. Michael Lewis is just waving his hands going, the money is always there. And this is, by the way, I'll finish this one point and then we can move on. But, the fundamental disconnect or misdirect, the lie that Michael Lewis, Sam Bankman-Fried, and all of his allies constantly repeat is the money was always there, which what they mean by that is Sam stole your deposits, but then he made really good investments with them, so it's all okay. This is the fundamental kind of ethical stance that SBF presented at trial through his lawyers. It's the perspective that Michael Lewis puts in his book. It's the perspective that a bunch of other like Yale and Ivy League allies have put forward in various defenses of Sam. And that, I think, maps pretty closely this idea that, like, just because you signed an agreement saying that I wouldn't touch your money, I'm going to touch your money because I know what to do with it. I'm the smartest. I've got the most effective choices to make about where to invest. I'm going to do the best job because I'm the smartest, and therefore it's okay. That is also effective altruism. And what it comes down to is, while they focus on the charity part of it, the predicate is they believe that people with high IQs should have all the money and make decisions with no democratic input. And of course, FTX, I think, symbolizes the outcome of that kind of hubris and egotism, which is, if you believe that you're never going to make a mistake, the mistakes that you make become really huge. And so that's the sort of core thesis of the book. And that's why I think it's important. And I do think that, Brady Dale's book is very good, but in all humility, I think that my book, given that it was after the trial and took all that information into account, I think it's the best single source on the case.
Yeah, well, we learned a lot during the trial, right? Just during the discovery and during all the testimonies and everything. There's just a lot of new information that came out. So I think it warrants like a second look to sort of repackage everything, right? And how do we reinterpret this given the new information that we have? I did want to ask. I didn't want to ask about this so soon in the conversation, but since you brought it up, I thought I'd just pivot to this. But it does seem like there's been kind of this renaissance on Twitter lately of kind of like, I guess I've been calling them like SBF truthers, right? Where it's like, oh, he's actually innocent. Like he's, the money was always there. Like he was framed. There was some sort of, globalist conspiracy or something. I mean, maybe kind of walk us through like, what is the nature of this like weird corner of the internet? Like what are their points that they're really like, what are the pillars of this ideology?
There are two aspects to this. And one, I think I want to make a general observation, because we've also seen recently Do Kwon got sentenced about like last week. And Do Kwon really committed obvious fraud. He collaborated with Jump Trading to artificially maintain the peg of a thing that he claimed was algorithmically stabilized. And he faked transactions, and he was a complete piece of shit as a human being. And yet there are these people who say Do Kwon is innocent and should be freed. And, you look at them and they're mostly people who are still invested in Luna or Luna Classic or something like this. So it's just their bags thinking for them. And there is a little bit of that in FTX, where like people who got tricked don't want to admit that they got tricked. And so maybe they're just like holding SBF up. And another thing that I get into in the book is that, like, in crypto, in tech, in particular right now, people love heroes. People love Elon Musk. People love to be able to call people geniuses. People want to like offload their decision making to somebody who they trust more than themselves. And once you're in that situation and that person turns out to be a fraud, you're back to relying on your own judgment. And so you either double down, or if you have some emotional maturity, you can accept that you got tricked. But there are people who have trouble accepting that they've been tricked once that happens. And so you do have, in every fraud, you have these people who are like, the last Japanese soldier on the island still fighting the war, who think that like nothing happened and this was all some like grand conspiracy. In FTX's case, there is an added layer, though, which is we already know that Joe Bankman and Barbara Fried, Sam Bankman-Fried's parents, have engaged in a long-term campaign to try and get their son out of prison by any means necessary. And that has included lobbying the Trump administration recently. That has included getting their friends, people like John Donahue and Ian Ayers, who are Yale/Stanford law professors, to write big essays saying why FTX was never bankrupt. They have this campaign going on. And whether the people on Twitter are, actual individuals who are part of that campaign, or whether there's like some paid bot activity going on there. It's hard to say, but you have to look at those things when they pop up as possibly evidence of a continued coordinated disinformation campaign by the parents. And the other thing I would ask you, actually, since you saw some of this stuff, is he had his appeal hearing, I'm going to say a month ago, and it was a disaster. It was an embarrassing disaster. They put forward the same argument that like he made good decisions with the stolen money. And of course, literally the appeals court judges laughed at that. And I felt like after that hearing about a month ago, some of it died down. Like they pulled back. They were like, we can't. But I don't know if you observed the same thing, or whether maybe I just blocked a couple of the right accounts and it all fell off my feed.
Well, I mean, it seems to have, it's kind of come and gone in waves ever since the collapse, right? Like the last 3 years. I feel like it's sometimes it always comes in different forms, whether it's some folks just saying like, oh, the money was always there, or it's some folks saying that there's some like bigger conspiracy at play and he was just like the puppet in some sort of, globalist, shenanigans or something, or like there was some sort of political involvement. I mean, it seems like the trutherism sort of takes multiple different, and it just sort of goes in different varieties, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, my my deep trutherism, which I get into a little bit in the book, is, I do think there's a real possibility that there was, what we recently call a deep state connection here. For one thing, like this is speculative, but let's talk about it. Sullivan and Cromwell was one of the primary law firms servicing SBF or FTX, and also they ran the bankruptcy. Sullivan and Cromwell is also notoriously the CIA's favorite law firm. And they were inside FTX. Sam Bankman-Fried accused them of feeding evidence to the government to support his conviction. And my hypothetical on this is that there is some reason to believe that intelligence operations would have found an offshore centralized exchange like FTX useful. And maybe they wanted a hand in it. And then that, in fact, under this scenario, again, hypothetical, SBF kind of screwed around in contradiction to whatever state agenda there might have been here, committed crimes, even though there was like support from government or other background players, perhaps. And so I think that both of those things can actually be true, is one way to put it. But the sort of trutherism is also connected to Sullivan and Cromwell, because another kind of group of people who are out there and have kind of gotten sucked into saying SBF did nothing wrong are people who have been critical of the bankruptcy process. And there are fair criticisms of the bankruptcy process, both in terms of like expenditures, which are obviously huge for a legal process of this scale. And I think, a little bit more dicey, people have criticisms about how the estate handled certain assets. So I think they missed out on future gains of like Solana and Anthropic shares. But you can't really like expect a bankruptcy group to like maximize return. Like nobody can maximize returns on any asset because everything is probabilistic. So I find those criticisms a little bit specious, but those people have kind of turned their bitterness at the bankruptcy process into essentially a conspiracy theory that Sullivan and Cromwell forced SBF to declare bankruptcy, which is his version of events, right? That like his version of events now is that if you had let me keep running the thing for another 6 months, everything would have been fine, which of course is like every fraudster ever was like, I was going to win it all back in one last trade, which is literally the like, okay. I'm going to let Steve say hi because he's about to walk on the keyboard, and then I'm going to throw him on the ground. So it's very complicated. There are, several different reasons that people theorize that something went on other than what it appears. But they're all kind of converge on the same thing, where it's like, if you'd gotten full value for the assets that he bought with stolen funds, everything would have been fine. So there's just this like missing piece of logic, where like, no matter what you say, he still stole the money, and that's pretty well established.
Yeah, and not to belabor this point, but I feel like the this whole like trutherism movement kind of became serious, at least in my view, when I think it was maybe earlier this year, back in March or something. He went on the Tucker Carlson podcast, like from prison, which like I didn't know you could do that, like just go do podcast interviews while you're in prison.
Well, as it turns out, you can't. But go on.
So, but he goes on there, and Tucker kind of gave him like a platform to just sort of talk a bit. I mean, I don't think Tucker like pushed back very hard against him, but SBF was kind of maintaining all these claims and just saying all this stuff, like kind of what you were reiterating, like, we had the money, like everything was okay, and we didn't really do anything wrong, and maybe made some mistakes here or there, but it also seems like there's no sort of like contrition or acknowledgement that he did anything wrong, right?
Not only that, but it's like really cravenly strategic. And in fact, one of the things we saw at trial was after the collapse, Sam Bankman-Fried wrote himself a list of like how to recover from this, how to like dig out from this hole. And one of the things on his list was come out as a Republican and against the woke agenda. Quote. That's a quote. And about a year and a half after he wrote that list of to-dos, maybe 2 years, because it was about a year after the trial that he really got going on this. Well, I guess I can't remember the timeline, but so he didn't go on Tucker first. He actually went on a small, or he did an interview with a small kind of right-wing newspaper, the New York Sun, I think. I might be getting that incorrect, but he did a test run at a much smaller platform where he was, again, not just talking about this whole, like, I could pay everybody back thing, but emphasizing that his sentiments were turning more right-wing. So it's this totally craven thing where, okay, now Donald Trump is in power. I need to talk about how much I like Donald Trump. And in the, I can't remember whether it was the Tucker Carlson interview or the previous one, where he talks about, I have become more sympathetic to the chainsaw. And the chainsaw he's referring to, of course, is the Elon Musk chainsaw wielded under the Doge regime of like cost cutting, right? And like one of the points that I try to drive home in my book is that Sam Bankman-Fried was presented as this genius in public, as somebody who had this like next level understanding of this, that, and the third. But the objective reality, if you look at the decisions that he has made, especially the decisions, I mean, both the decisions before and after his trial, this man is a fucking idiot. He doesn't know anything and he doesn't know what he's doing. And the Tucker Carlson interview is an amazing example of this. So he did this little thing for the New York Sun. Then he did this Tucker Carlson interview. He did not get authorization for this media interview. He did it. If you look, his hair is all messed up. He did it on like a prison iPad where I guess supposedly you're just supposed to take calls from family. As a result of giving this Tucker Carlson interview, he had been in the MDC in Manhattan where he wanted to be for delusional reasons. He was like preparing his appeal, which his appeal was literally nothing but the case that they presented at trial with a different lawyer stamping her feet and going, but I'm right. So I don't know what he spent all those years at MTC doing, but the Tucker Carlson interview came out. He got pulled out of MDC and sent to an actual prison as sort of a punitive measure for that. This has happened to him before. In the summer before his criminal trial, he leaked Carolyn Ellison's diaries to a couple of, I must say, very sympathetic reporters at the New York Times, including one who has a family connection to Bankman-Fried, which the New York Times never disclosed, I might add. He leaked these diaries as an attempt to assassinate Carolyn Ellison's character. Judge Kaplan ruled that it was witness intimidation. At that time, he was on house arrest in California, very comfy, hanging out with his parents and his dog. He leaks Ellison's diaries. He gets pulled out of house arrest, put in the MDC with Diddy. And so these are the decisions that Sam Bankman-Fried has made in the course of his own defense. And he just can't win for losing. He's a very, very strategically naive little man-child. And he can't seem to stop himself.
That was an epic rant. I got to give you credit for that. So I have a number of different things I want to pivot this conversation to, but maybe let's just focus on, for now, let's focus on kind of the post-trial sort of new information that you were able to glean and incorporate into the book, and kind of advance this whole story of who is Sam Bankman-Fried beyond maybe what we already knew. What would you say that we've, that you've been able to, massage into your book, into this narrative? Like, what would you say that we've learned about him, kind of throughout the whole process of the trial and then post? I mean, I know what you were just mentioning is maybe something we can kind of add into that, but what kind of new information came out that you were able to weave into the narrative here?
So I think there's a lot that I could talk about, but one that I just mentioned the Carolyn Ellison diaries, and both in her own testimony at trial and in a sentencing memo sent by her defense team as part of her plea deal, we learned a lot more about their relationship. And I think it really revealed a lot more, both about SBF as a person and sort of effective altruism itself. Specifically, it really seems like Carolyn Ellison was in love with Sam Bankman-Fried, and he took advantage of her emotions to use her as his puppet, as a sort of fake CEO of Alameda Research. And this was always more or less the concern. The crypto industry really needs to take seriously how badly it misread the situation, because I'm sure you remember everybody was talking when FTX first started rising, like, well, there's this thing, Alameda, they own a hedge fund that's like trading on the platform, and it's owned by the same guy. Like, isn't that maybe a problem? And everybody was like, I mean, theoretically it's a problem, but it's crypto, so whatever. And then it turned out to really be a problem. And one of the reasons that it was really a problem is that Carolyn Ellison was not operating as an independent executive of that entity. SBF was giving her like trading orders and all kinds of other direction, even though, this is where FTX looks an awful lot like Enron. I won't go into the weeds, but Enron used a lot of sort of fake third parties to hide debt. And among other things, FTX used Alameda as a fake third party to offload a bunch of this FTT token, where FTX would have really looked bad if they were using that to get loans directly. But by basically, this is actually a really important fact that Brady Dale found out after the collapse, which was that FTX basically just gifted a ton of FTT to Alameda, which was FTT was this exchange token, kind of traded like equity in the entity, even though it had no legal claim. But, as FTX rose and fell, so did FTT. But because it's an equity-like instrument, you can't like use that as an asset on your own balance sheet as FTX. But if you hand it to Alameda, all of a sudden it's a usable asset. And so that was definitely one of the things that we figured out later, was why that balance sheet looked so weird, why Alameda had all that FTT. But I was talking about Carolyn Ellison, and we learned a lot more about Sam basically manipulating her, both through their emotional connection and through sort of effective altruism principles, which was, even after she became aware of the fraud and was threatening to leave because the stress was too great, Sam Bankman-Fried told her, you're going to be most effective here. You shouldn't leave because it would be more effective for you to stay here. That is, even though you're doing something morally wrong and it's more effective if you keep doing that. And that worked on her, at least in part, and with some help from her, romantic feelings. And so I think what it really boils down to is it shows just how bad of a person he was, because he was just manipulating everybody around him sort of nakedly. And then, of course, when she turned against them, he was perfect against him. He had no compunctions about leaking embarrassing stuff about her and trying to destroy her life. So I think the image of SBF as like this friendly, cuddly guy prevailed quite a bit when he was on the rise. And I think the trial really showed that he was, and, to give credit where it's due, Michael Lewis also tells some stories in his book that he seems to show Sam doing one thing, but really show him being a total asshole. And so we got some more insight into basically how bad Sam sucked, I think, is one of the big takeaways.
Well, one point that I've always maybe perhaps the point I've thought the most about over this whole journey is because I remember dealing with Sam back in like 2019 and 2020 when people he was just kind of this emerging superstar and people were like, oh my gosh, who is this guy? He's this, brainiac, like this, superhero type guy. And he was, but there was just something about him that kind of, I've never been able to like put my finger on like why were people so drawn to him and so attracted to him, right? He's kind of like this kind of weird guy. Like, I remember even at CoinDesk, like, all the girls at CoinDesk, like they all thought he was like really cute and funny when he would swear, like they would like giggle about it. Like, oh, he's so cute, but like this image of him as this kind of like, not even like this renegade, but this just like this kind of no BS. Like, I don't have time for all this, like a compliance.
Well, no BS,
bullshit,
but also
like,
the adult in the room at the same time. And I think that like maybe what you're talking about, I mean, the charm part is significant, right? That like, and I want to talk about that, but what you're talking about also is the idea that he was saying kind of like, or at least people perceived him as saying, I know crypto is a fraud, but I can make money trading it, and therefore I can get positive ends out of it. Or like he basically didn't have any. He certainly had no ideological commitments to the like underlying principles of crypto when he first got involved in it. I mean, he started out as a trader while he was still a little bit at Jane Street. Maybe he was doing it on the side, but then certainly in roughly 2017, he spent a summer as an intern at the Center for Effective Altruism, or like a fundraising assistant. He's doing some small role there. And during that time, he talked about like he actually spent most of his time trading crypto. He's a degen, I think, is the fairest way to say it, and not in the cool way, but in the actual like gambling addict way. A lot of people who worked at Alameda in the very early days talked about the fact that he would personally make just like unbelievable amounts of trades, which most of them were bad. So he was compulsive. And obviously, Sam had prescriptions for things like Adderall and selegiline and things to treat his ADHD and depression. But also the people around him were sort of recreationally using stimulants, Adderall, other methamphetamine varieties to juice themselves up. And so this like compulsive nature of the activity was very much a defining feature of FTX. And more generally of, I think this, one of the things I try and do in my book is like plug that speed, literally like the actual medicine and the practice back into the way that Silicon Valley thinks about itself as like, we got to go fast. We got to go fast. And now we have it. One of the successors of effective altruism is effective accelerationism, which is, and abundance, which is a different version of, we need no regulations. We need nothing to slow us down so that we can constantly keep doing this. And this endless, ceaseless activity with no reflection, no stop to pause, and not effective. One of the things about about methamphetamines or amphetamines of various kinds is that they make you experience inside your own head that your brain is working better. But in fact, according to objective metrics, they don't make you any smarter. So you just make the same mistakes more compulsively. And everybody at FTX was on, or not everybody at FTX was on speed, but we do know that speed was very widespread. And I'm talking about like Adderall, but it's basically just speed. Was very widespread, was being dispensed apparently without prescriptions by a doctor on staff there. And so that kind of like manic activity is very much characteristic of what was going on there too.
Yeah. And one of the characteristics of these types of drugs is like, the high persists as long as you keep taking it. And then once you stop taking it, then it's just everything collapses, right? And it takes you days to recover. It's like this whole, so the analogy is actually quite effective in the sense of what you're trying to describe.
There's a crash. Not only a crash, but like you have to up your dose. You develop resistance, or what's it? I forget the term.
Tolerance.
Like your tolerance goes up, right? And Carolyn Ellison wrote about this actually in records that made it into trial. That her or I can't remember whether they were in trial or just in her sentencing pleas from her defense team, but she was taking recreational or performance enhancing Adderall and or Ritalin or whatever, and sort of observed like my tolerance is going up. I keep taking more and more, and she was definitely one of the people who, felt after the fact that her judgment had been impaired by these drugs. And in her sentencing memo, she wrote that like the abuse of Adderall left her more susceptible to suggestions by SBF, left her less likely to ask questions about whether what they were doing was right or wrong. And so, yeah, that seems to be an indicator about kind of the broader context of FTX as a whole.
I want to pivot here slightly to talk a bit more about effective altruism, because I know this is one of the main points of the book you get at, and it is kind of interesting. It's effective. I first heard about this in like 2018 or 19. I know like the BitMEX founders were, I think it was Ben Delo was his name. He was one of these big effective altruism proponents. So there's been this big overlap between not just crypto and effective altruism, maybe just tech generally and effective altruism. It seemed particularly prevalent within crypto, and Sam obviously subscribed to this theory quite heavily. But then after the crash, it seems like I haven't really heard people going around talking about or promoting effective altruism, like post the crash, post FTX crash, right, for obvious reasons. But maybe just kind of give us like a bit of, maybe folks who aren't like super aware or super familiar, maybe give kind of a quick intro, like what this concept is, and then how it, I think your argument in the book is that like Sam is sort of an outgrowth of a lot of this just very maybe like anti-human, sort of philosophy and culture that's embedded in this concept.
Yeah, there's a ton to get into, but to sort of put it in very accelerated terms, effective altruism is not one thing. It has evolved over time. Basically, in the early 2010s, a guy named Will MacAskill and another guy named Toby Ord, who are professors at Oxford and still are, amazingly, they picked up the work of an Australian ethicist named Peter Singer from the 1970s, who does this thought experiment about, if you saw a child drowning in a pond, but you were going to get your very expensive shoes dirty, would you save the child? And the obvious answer is yes, of course. I'm not going to worry about my expensive shoes if there's a kid who needs saving. Singer's point is that certainly in the 1970s, there were interventions that could be made in the developing world, in Africa, South America, places like that, where a very small financial stake from somebody in the Western world could have a huge impact. And so the effectiveness of effective altruism to some extent derives from any global inequality of that period, and just the idea that a United States dollar goes really far in Zimbabwe or something. And so they did things like they bought bed nets. Bed nets is one of these very effective interventions because for just a few cents, you can give somebody a place to sleep where they're not going to get infected by malaria while they're asleep. And this actually does have serious benefits. Very successful program, very good embodiment of the best ideals of effective altruism. And, if it had stuck with that, it would have been controversial, but not in a sort of global sense, just kind of a different approach to nonprofits and giving. The problem is that starting in around 2016 or so, effective altruism, two things happened. Will MacAskill came up with a really bad idea called earn to give. And at the same time, effective altruism started getting closer to the so-called rationalists in Silicon Valley. Effective altruism, its origins, as I said, are at Oxford and in Australia. Rationalism is in Silicon Valley, and those two kind of started to merge. Earn to give is Will MacAskill's sort of sin to the world, I guess. What he said was that if you are a person who had potentials for high earnings, so specifically if you're somebody who's gifted at things that are useful in the finance industry, that you should go do that rather than, for example, become a teacher, become a doctor, spend your time volunteering, or in any other way, like directly contribute to the betterment of humankind. And this sort of set off a chain of thinking that sort of degenerated the entire movement, frankly. Will MacAskill and SBF had a lunch in like 2012 And this earn to give idea was planted in his head. And so instead of doing anything else, SBF went into finance, which of course ultimately led to one of the greatest frauds in human history. Not only that, but along the way, Will McCaskill reportedly actively participated in the cover up of allegations made against SBF in 2018 at Alameda Research. So, McCaskill specifically has been removed from leadership positions. He funneled about $36 million worth of at least commingled customer funds to nonprofits that he controlled or sat on the board of in the 2 years from 2020 to 2022. And so, Will McCaskill does seem to have been implicated in some actual wrongdoing. But the ideas are just as problematic because from earn to give, where, instead of being a doctor and going to help people, go trade on Wall Street, sure, you'll enjoy a luxurious lifestyle, but then you'll give away so much more of your money that it's better. You'll be like 4 doctors, basically, was the argument. But from there, once you start saying okay, if I leverage, basically effective altruism became about leverage, financial leverage, time leverage, whatever. And so then you have people saying oh, we should think longer term into the future. What if our effective altruism was figuring out how to stop the future AI apocalypse that's going to destroy all of humanity? This is an idea they picked up from rationalism, from Eliezer Yudkowsky. And then that really became AI safety became the core of effective altruism. No more, they were still doing mosquito nets and whatever, but they really started putting a lot of money into this idea of the Terminator is coming. So this is a canard that the entirety of Silicon Valley got pulled into. But it was particularly pernicious for effective altruism because they framed it as charity. And this is why, by the way, Sam Bankman-Fried made this investment in Anthropic, the AI startup that became such a huge part of the recovery, because Anthropic is an effective altruism inflected rationalist startup aimed at AI safety more than AI development. So they, for example, Claude, I think to this day still has some slightly more safe practices than competing models. So they actually kind of do what they say, but it's still a sketchy idea. And so all of this stuff, all of effective altruism, which kind of started out as a basically pretty okay idea, it's fine. Everybody should probably give a little bit more of their income to good causes and use evidence-based methods to decide where that money should go to have the most impact. But then they just frankly went insane. They went tech insane. And started thinking about AI and started thinking about meteor strikes, which are almost, they're talking about the far future. So those are literally unpredictable. And all of this stuff, which I go into in the book, is it's all based on this totally false idea that if you have enough information and enough smart people, you can predict the future. That is implicit in everything that they say. Will McCaskill, and this is another sort of Will McCaskill is not a smart man. One of his really, really bad ideas is that future humans are ethically equivalent to presently living humans for people alive today, which, there is an ethical equivalency across time, right? Like if I shoot somebody in 2025, it's just as much of a crime as if I personally shoot somebody in 2050. But you can't make an ethical equivalence between present and future humans, again, because you don't actually know the impact of your actions today. So effective altruism started teaching all of its adherents that you have to think of all of your actions in terms of their impacts 1,000 years from now. And it turns out this is a formula for making young, impressionable engineers go quite literally insane. And we have some examples of this. I don't know if you saw this, but in January of this year, so almost a full year ago, we had the Zizian murders. And the Zizians were a Manson-like cult that grew out of rationalism and were motivated by AI safety theories to kill an old man in San Francisco and a Border Patrol agent in Maine. So that's the kind of chaos that this ethical perspective has generated in the world. And so this is where effective altruism has gone. It's basically synonymous with AI doom at this point, and basically the vast majority of their resources go into AI think tanks and things like that.
And then, so maybe talk a bit more. That's super helpful. I mean, this is an area I'm not super familiar with, but like I see all the manifestations of it, right? So even with like the Claude Anthropic example you brought up, like we know even in public policy conversations today, they're the ones that are kind of lobbying for all these like AI safety initiatives and things like that. And that they've kind of got this reputation as like they're the trying to be like the good guys or like the AI police type of thing. But when you mentioned it, we've known for a long time that Sam invested in Anthropic, but I hadn't made that connection in my mind until you mentioned it there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why, it's, and I would also even like take that further, right? Because at trial, they wanted to bring up Anthropic specifically as an example of this totally cockamamie theory of the case that because he invested the stolen money in good things, it's okay. But the reason Anthropic wound up being a good investment was because Sam was part of this tech aligned group of effective altruists who all invested in Anthropic. And so when everybody is investing in it, it goes up. That's what happens. Whether or not they're actually producing anything, whether or not they're actually making money, which, by the way, they're not. And so it's this game where they all went in the same frankly, I think, bad direction of AI. And because of that, herd behavior, they're claiming that they're like uniquely insightful geniuses. And I think that's a very common thread in how these people think.
Maybe talk a bit more about just how this effective altruism culture or this movement influenced Sam. Like how can you frame it that like Sam was a product of this? Maybe all of this FTX nonsense that we've lived through was like a product, it was an outgrowth of this. How would you make that argument?
In a very specific way, which is he, and Carolyn Ellison testified to this, and obviously his behavior speaks to it, but he regarded FTX customer deposits as, quote, a good source of capital. And of course, the user agreement, which, we've all seen the discussion of this in the aftermath of the collapse, but the user agreement that most FTX users signed promised that FTX would not use customer deposits for investments, for capital outlays, et cetera. It's an exchange. It's a custodian. And anybody in crypto knows that. And we have weird market structure, and there's a reason that we're trying to change that. But the way it works to this day, unfortunately, is that exchanges are also custodians. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. And so an exchange is expected to custody assets. That means not use them. And Sam explicitly promised that. And, he has, one of the parts of his fake version of events is that all of these deposits were in a margin lending program. But at trial, there was a forensic accountant who clearly showed that there was never even remotely enough enrollment in the margin lending program to justify Alameda having borrowed these funds. And so he did not regard, and the corollary to this is that he saw it as good capital, and also, as Carolyn Ellison testified, he, as a utilitarian, which is, in summary, somebody who believes that the ends justify the means, and utilitarianism is basically the core of effective altruism, which I go into in my book. It's a longer term philosophical movement. But he believed that the ends justified the means, and that hard rules like don't lie and don't steal could not be justified under a utilitarian ethics. And so he didn't have to abide by that user agreement, according to at least what he had gotten from effective altruism. And, people will argue that he misinterpreted effective altruism, but like he's having conversations one-on-one with the leaders of this movement. So if he misinterpreted it, they have some, responsibility for that. Right. And so that's where the effective altruism manifested as crime. And I think, one of the things that I argue is that this is, whether or not you call it effective altruism, this is like much bigger than that. It's a way that people in Silicon Valley think about how they deploy capital, which is, to put it in very stark terms, these stupid fucking rubes have no idea what they're doing with their money. And so we should decide for them. And so you have things like Chamath Palihapitiya running all these SPACs where he's like, oh, these are going to be huge. Of course, they were disasters. I mean, I still to this day maintain that Tesla is a stock fraud based on far future promises about Optimus robots that no industry needs, and full self-driving that 10 years later still doesn't work. So this is the way that tech came to work basically in the zero interest rate era, that you could just use hype, get people to drop money on you, and effectively lie your way through. And effective altruism is an ethics that, and by the way, Elon Musk has described effective altruism as something like what he believes. So take that as you will. And so you have this, like, I don't know, there's a rationalization for deception built into the ethics of effective altruism, and Sam took it that way.
Would you say that effective altruism is perhaps a way of maybe like eliminating some of the cognitive dissonance that these people experience, where you're, because on one hand you're like, okay, we're just going 100 miles an hour, trying to like make as much money as we can, we're trying to just build all this stuff as much as we can, and kind of to hell with the consequences. But on the other hand, we're doing a lot of good for the world by using these principles and these skills that we've learned and in these kind of superpowers we've acquired essentially to do good for the world. Is it like is it like a cognitive, like you're trying to get rid of that cognitive dissonance? Like it's the same way.
It's absolutely it's not just about like the ethics. It's literally just solving the cognitive dissonance of trying to be a good person who's also a billionaire. And specifically with Sam, if you go back and listen to his interviews from like 2020, 2021, he talks very openly about like, if you're just an individual living your life, there's really, I'm not going to get the exact quote right, but basically he says that like, after a certain point as an individual, there's no more reasonable justification for you having a certain amount of money after you get to like whatever it is, 100 million, 500 million, like you can't spend money past that point. So like, why do you have it? He expressed this anxiety, right? Like, but he says, once you're thinking about the entire world, well, then you can earn as much money as you want. And there's theoretically a rationalization for it because you're talking about changing the entire world. Of course, the missing middle here is effective altruism, and Sam absolutely had no place for the democratic allocation of resources into social needs. So the implicit claim there is that if I'm smart enough to make $1 billion, then I'm also smart enough to deploy it in the way that's going to benefit the world most. That runs throughout EA, and it's never talked about. It's under the surface that like we should have more rich people making decisions with the money that they earn in order to improve the world, because if you're rich, you must be smart. And of course, as Sam Bankman-Fried demonstrated, that is not necessarily the case.
Well, David, I have a lot of other questions I want to ask you, but we're running out of time here. Maybe I'll ask you, I'll throw you this question as a, just to wrap things up here. But I mean, what do you think? I mean, you're obviously like not a big fan of Sam, and you're very critical of him and everything that he's kind of come from and he represents. But like, I mean, if I had to ask you, like, what was maybe like his most redeeming quality? Like, what would you say?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's a very good question because I don't think he said an honest thing in his life. For anybody who doesn't remember, right after this all happened, he got into a Twitter DM exchange with a Vox reporter named Kelsey Piper, where he effectively confessed that even the like perverted version of effective altruism that he claimed was just a shibboleth, is the word that he used, which means performative. So he admitted that he was faking his ethics the entire time, even though his version of the ethics was already shit. And so it's like, it's actually pretty hard to find anything redeeming. I mean, I think that not so much the redeeming quality, but the thing that you have to empathize with Sam about is that he is, neurodivergent in a very substantial way. And that comes in a few ways. I mean, I think that he is neurodivergent in some very significant ways. And that comes in a few varieties. He talked about having to practice facial expressions. He had a hard time conveying or understanding people's emotions. He was maybe, I mean, Later, they tried to claim that he was autistic, which would have meant that he was bad at like communicating, but he wasn't. He was actually quite good at communicating. You observe people found him quite charming. And so I think this is another misdirect. But he did suffer definitely from clinical depression of a very severe sort his entire life. He talked a lot about having very few emotions, experiencing very little joy, and again, having to like fake his interactions with people. And so I think that like if it's not a redeeming quality, but you have to empathize with Sam. He's not a complete human being. And it's very hard not to demonize him. And I'll admit I do. And I think that it is important. Like there are neurodivergent people who need to be separated from the population. And specifically, Sam is a sociopath, which means that he does not experience empathy for other people. And for the suffering of others. And I think this is actually a decent place to end on talking about effective altruism, which is, one of the reasons I think effective altruism appeals to a certain group of people is, and I think Sam exemplified this, I think I take people at their word when they describe Sam as a teenager saying that he wanted to do good for the world. But because he suffered from, I believe, clinical sociopathy, he did not actually have the moral instincts that most of us take for granted. The desire to see other people do well, the desire to actually help others that comes natively to us when we're with our families and our friends. I think that to varying degrees. So if you look at sociopathy research, some of it is definitely neurological. About 50% is neurological, about 50% is sociological. So, for example, there are much lower rates of sociopathy in Japan and China, where there's much more teaching of the kind of interconnectedness and interdependence of human society. I think that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are trained to be sociopaths. They're being trained right now by, people saying that empathy is like the worst thing about Western culture. Elon Musk is now throwing this line around that like we must stop being empathetic. We must stop caring about people. This was one of the messages of effective altruism, that your empathy for individuals could actually distort your view of what was the most effective way of spending money. So the really horrendous example that Will McCaskill gives in one of his books is, if your uncle has cancer, you might be inclined to give money to cancer research. But wait, the fact that your uncle has cancer might be distorting your view of what the most effective way of spending this money is. And so you should not worry about your uncle. You should think about the totality of everything. You should think about everybody's total happiness. This is utilitarianism. They measure, or they pretend to measure, human happiness using this unit called utils, which is a made-up unit that doesn't measure anything actually real, but that they claim is like their way of talking about the total aggregate of human happiness. This is also the lie underlying effective altruism and all utilitarian philosophies, which is they claim for themselves the authority to have and the insight to have total information and total insight into the happiness of all humans alive now and into the future, which is quite clearly an impossible thing for anyone to know. And it's why we have ethical rules, which is we have what's called epistemic humility. We acknowledge that we as individuals cannot know everything. The effective altruists basically have built an entire philosophy around the assumption that because they're smart, they can know everything. They can measure the impact of everything that they're going to do and maximize it. So they're not going to give a donation to a cancer research fund just because their uncle has cancer. Empathy is the enemy of effective altruism, just like it's the enemy of whatever it is Elon Musk believes today. And I think this is like where I know that this started off as like me trying to find something redeeming about Sam, right? But I think that it's not so much redeeming, but contrary to EA, contrary to this right-wing ideology being spouted right now, you do have to have empathy for Sam as a victim. He did have mental, neurological disabilities that made him uniquely prone to victimization by these ideas of no empathy, measure everything, you're the smartest, take control, you deserve to spend the money. Like these are pitches being made to engineers in Silicon Valley still to this day, even if it's not under the label of effective altruism. And these people are vulnerable, they want to do good. Carolyn Ellison was born and raised a devout Catholic. She wanted to do good, but then she lost her faith. She lost her belief in God. And effective altruism came in and replaced God for Carolyn Ellison. And as I discuss in the book, this is a common thread among a lot of effective altruists. They're formerly religious people who needed a new compass, needed a new way to make moral decisions because they had relied on God. Maybe they did not have, the lived experience to be able to make moral decisions on their own just because they valued human life and human happiness. They needed this system. They needed this bigger picture to plug into their brains. And this is where, they think about this stuff as like mental technology, where you just plug in and read a thing and change your brain, which is not how brains work. Maybe it's how AIs will work eventually. It's not even how AIs work now. So I think I can't think of anything nice to say about Sam except that he was a victim. I think that's the nicest thing I can think to say.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. And I think when you look at Sam, like there is this that like you can't help but think like, wow, like this kid, he's obviously very smart. Well, I mean, you don't think he's very smart, but he's capable of.
He's a good odds maker. Have you ever seen Casino? Yeah. Sam is the Robert De Niro character from Casino. He absolutely knows where the line is and how to make money in every single situation where there are odds to be drawn. That's what he's smart at. It might be he's smart at two things. He's smart at odds making, and he's smart at pretending to be smart about other things.
Right. Well, but I found what you were on your last point there, what you were mentioning, just super interesting because you're talking about how it's this ideology that it's kind of rebranded itself a bit since like post FTX, like that was the FTX collapse and the whole Sam incident was kind of a black-eyed effective altruism, and they've kind of rebranded it. It's this thing that kind of keeps, it's just sort of metamorphosizes into another thing or another label or whatever. I think you mentioned earlier, now it's kind of turning into this idea of like, abundance and these other types of things. Some of the same ideas, just packaged differently, but same concepts, right?
Yeah, and the same people. Abundance is being pushed by Ezra Klein and Matthew Iglesias, both of whom were part of Vox, which was a major part of promoting the effective altruist line. So they specifically are just continuing their old ideas under different branding.
Something that people should be aware of, right? When we're involved in tech culture and so, to some extent, like these ideas just seem to permeate all over the place, right? And I think without really having understanding of like where these ideas come from and like where they end up, it's very easy to kind of buy into the hype of it. It's almost like when you're a college kid and you hear about communism for the first time, like, oh, it sounds great, like who wouldn't like this? And then you learn about what it actually is, like, okay, maybe.
And it is mostly young people, I mean, the sort of rationalist EA connection going back to like 2012 or whatever. People might know Eliza Yudkowsky wrote this book called Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, which was specifically targeted at young people to recruit them into rationalism and by extension into effective altruism. And so it's very much focused on young people who are like looking for guidance. And that was explicitly the recruiting method. And there's a lot more to say about rationalism, which is, if not a cult itself, certainly has bred cults. So I think that like very canny, active recruitment of smart but vulnerable people is also definitely a part of the story here, big time. And it has continued. I mean, I don't think they have quite as much, of the actual like cult activity, because they used to literally have like meetings and deprogrammings and weird stuff going on. But the, offering something to people who are not being given coherent ideas from other sources is still, it's how you promote an ideology.
Yeah. Wow. This is fascinating stuff, David. I really appreciate you coming on the show to share a bit more about your learnings with Sam specifically, and also this deep dive you've done into this effective altruism ideology that kind of created this or led to this whole sort of mess with FTX and Sam in the first place. And I think you've just really done a really good job of connecting these pieces together. And there's a lot of like good food for thought here, and worthy of contemplation and worthy of just like further discourse as we.
Yeah. And for those who want to contemplate, this is the book. I should have gotten a backwards copy printed so it would show up right. But, it's available. It's not expensive. $15 for 350 pages of content. You're not going to get a better deal anywhere.
Amazing. Be sure to check out David's book. We'll have a link to it in the notes here. And David, really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, I would also plug my Substack, davidzmorris.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter at davidzmorris. I write about other frauds a lot. So if you're interested in fraud and crypto fraud in particular, check out that Substack. And there's a lot to go through there.
Amazing. Well, David, really appreciate you sharing your time with us today here. This has been a really interesting conversation. And I'm definitely looking forward to following your work more in the future. And hopefully, I really think like your work is very, I mean, just as that there's a review that came out of your book of a few weeks ago that was kind of talking about how this is one of the more important books that has come out this year in terms of.
I was very excited. American Prospect got a very good review. So it was extremely fun.
Yeah. I think the next year we're going to be seeing a lot just about kind of this dark side of tech, right? Whether it comes from, even like there's kind of like this backlash against tech in some way as we start learning a bit more about, and it's going to come from all directions. It's not just going to be like a right wing or a left wing thing. I think it's going to come from all directions. And it's very, I think, having an understanding of some of these ideas and where they come from is going to be very important to interpreting this stuff properly.
Yeah, you got to see through the bullshit. There's so much bullshit out there. FTX was actually shockingly bad at the bullshit. He couldn't keep it going. Other people are better at it, and they're keeping it going. So keep an eye on it. It eventually is going to crash too.
Well, on that exciting note, David, really appreciate you joining us today, and thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Aaron.